The rain falls gently against your window tonight, each droplet a whisper from a time when water reshaped the world. Close your eyes and let that sound carry you back to a moment when the heavens opened and civilizations vanished beneath waves that rose like mountains. We've all heard the story, haven't we? Noah and his ark, a tale of divine judgment and miraculous survival. But what if I told you that this flood, this great deluge that echoes through every culture on Earth, wasn't the beginning of our story, but the end of another one entirely? Welcome to History for Sleep, where tonight we dive beneath the waters of time to explore a possibility that could rewrite everything we think we know about human civilization. I'm your host, and for the next hour, I want you to forget the history books, forget the timelines you memorized in school, and open your mind to a truth that's been hidden beneath layers of silt and sediment for thousands of years. Picture this: advanced cities with towering spires, technologies we can barely comprehend today, and civilizations that map the stars with precision that rivals our modern instruments. Now imagine all of it disappearing in a matter of days, swallowed by waters that rose faster than anyone could escape. The survivors, scattered and traumatized, could only pass down fragments of what once was, stories that became myths, myths that became legends, legends that we now dismiss as fairy tales. But what if they weren't fairy tales at all? Tonight we're going to explore the possibility that the Great Flood wasn't just a natural disaster or divine punishment, but a reset button pressed on human civilization itself. A catastrophic event so complete, so devastating, that it erased nearly every trace of advanced societies that once thrived across our planet. And the evidence, my friends, is hiding in plain sight. From the perfectly carved megaliths that dot our landscape like signatures from a lost age, to the mathematical precision found in ancient structures that shouldn't exist according to our understanding of prehistoric capabilities. From flood myths that span every continent and culture, all describing the same impossible event, to geological evidence of massive water displacement that occurred at precisely the time these stories claim. We'll journey through the ruins of what might have been, examining artifacts that don't fit our timeline, technologies that seem impossibly advanced for their supposed age, and patterns of destruction that suggest something far more significant than gradual cultural evolution. Because what if Charles Darwin's theory of gradual change doesn't apply to human civilization? What if instead of a slow climb from caves to cities, we've experienced cycles of rise and catastrophic fall? The ancient Mesopotamians spoke of the antediluvian kings, rulers who lived for thousands of years before the flood changed everything. The Egyptians recorded the Zep-Tepi, the first time, when gods walked among men and built monuments that still puzzle our greatest engineers. The Hindus describe the Yugas, vast cycles of time where humanity rises to incredible heights before falling into darkness, only to rise again. But before we dive deeper into these tantalizing clues, let me share something that will reshape hidden history. Recent how you think about our planet underwater archaeological discoveries have revealed cities and structures submerged beneath our above sea level during the last oceans, cities that were ice age. These aren't simple settlements, but sophisticated urban centers with advanced drainage systems, precisely cut stones, and architectural features that suggest knowledge we attribute to much later periods. Off the coast of Japan lies Yonaguni, a massive stone structure with terraces, steps, and right angles that nature simply doesn't create. Near India's coast, the lost city of Dwarka, described in ancient Sanskrit texts as a marvel of engineering, has been found exactly where the stories said it would be, submerged under 120 feet of water. And these are just the discoveries we've made public. The implications are staggering. If these cities were built when sea levels were lower, during the last ice age, then we're looking at advanced civilizations that existed 10,000 to 15,000 years ago, thousands of years before we supposedly invented agriculture writing, or complex societies. The flood that ended the Ice Age didn't just change the climate, it erased the evidence of who we really were. Think about it this way. If our current civilization were to face a similar catastrophe tomorrow, what would survive? Our cities of glass and steel would crumble within decades. Our digital records would vanish with the first power grid failure. Within a few centuries, only the most massive stone structures would remain, and even those would be weathered beyond easy recognition. The survivors, struggling to rebuild, would pass down stories of the time before, stories that would grow more mythical with each generation. This isn't speculation. It's exactly what we see in the archaeological record. Massive stone blocks, some weighing hundreds of tons, positioned with mathematical precision that we struggle to replicate today. Structures the Great Pyramid of Giza-like, aligned to celestial bodies, with an accuracy that requires advanced knowledge of astronomy and engineering. Megalithic sites across the globe, from Stonehenge to Easter Island, all built with techniques we can't fully explain, all potentially remnants of that lost world. Compelling evidence comes from the stories, but the most themselves. Every major civilization on Earth has flood myths, and they're not vague tales of local flooding. They describe a worldwide catastrophe, waters that covered the highest mountains, and a handful of survivors who preserved the knowledge of the old world. The details are remarkably consistent across cultures that supposedly had no contact with each other. The Sumerian Epic of Gilgamesh tells of Utnapishtim, who survived the flood in a great boat and was granted immortality. The Hindu Matsya Purana describes Manu, who saved humanity and the seeds of all life in a vessel guided by a great fish. Native American tribes from the Pacific Northwest to the Amazon basin all have stories of a great flood that reset the world, followed by culture heroes who taught the survivors how to rebuild. These weren't isolated events or coincidental myths. They're cultural memories of the same catastrophic event, preserved in oral tradition for thousands of years before being written down. The flood happened, and it changed everything. Now you might be thinking, but surely we would have found more evidence of these advanced civilizations. And that's where the genius of water comes in. Water doesn't just destroy, it preserves, but it preserves by hiding. The flood didn't just kill the antediluvian civilizations, it buried them under layers of sediment, submerged them beneath rising seas, and scattered their remains across ocean floors we've barely begun to explore. Consider this. We've explored less than 5% of our ocean floors. That means 95% of the underwater world remains unmapped and unexplored. If advanced civilizations once thrived in areas that are now underwater, we simply haven't found them yet because we haven't looked. The few underwater structures we have discovered suggest there's much more waiting to be revealed. But the flood wasn't just about water. Geological evidence points to a period of intense volcanic activity, massive earthquakes, and rapid climate change that occurred around 11,000 to 13,000 years ago. This wasn't a gentle rising of sea levels. It was a catastrophic reshaping of the planet's surface. Entire continents shifted, mountain ranges rose, and vast areas of land simply vanished beneath the waves. The Younger Dryas period, as scientists call it, marks a sudden return to Ice Age conditions after a warming trend, followed by an equally rapid warming that ended the Ice Age entirely. This climate whiplash would have been devastating to any civilization, no matter how advanced. Cities built for one climate would have been uninhabitable in another. Agricultural systems would have collapsed. Coastal civilizations would have been submerged as glaciers melted and sea levels rose by hundreds of feet. What makes this period even more intriguing is the evidence of impact events. Scientists have found layers of materials that suggest massive meteorite or comet impacts during this exact time frame. The Younger Dryas, impact hypothesis proposes that these cosmic impacts triggered the climate changes that ended the Ice Age. If true, then the flood wasn't just a natural cycle, it was caused by catastrophic impacts that would have made the destruction even more complete. Imagine advanced civilizations tracking these incoming objects, perhaps even trying to prepare for the impact. Ancient texts from around the world describe stars falling from heaven and fire from the sky in the time before the flood. The Book of Enoch describes the watchers who came down from heaven, bringing knowledge to humanity before a great judgment. What if these weren't supernatural beings but survivors or advanced scouts from civilizations that could see the catastrophe coming? This brings us to one of the most fascinating aspects of the flood reset theory: the idea that some knowledge was deliberately preserved. The myths don't just describe destruction, they describe careful preservation efforts. Noah's Ark wasn't just about saving animals, it was about preserving the genetic diversity needed to rebuild the world. Similar stories describe the preservation of seeds, knowledge, and skilled craftsmen. In the Sumerian king list, we find an intriguing pattern. Before the flood, kings are said to have ruled for thousands of years, suggesting either incredibly long lifespans or perhaps a different way of measuring time. After the flood, the reigns become more reasonable, more human in scale. It's as if the flood marked a transition from one type of civilization to another, from the advanced antediluvian world to our current post-flood reality. The Hindu concept of yugas describes this same pattern on a cosmic scale. Humanity begins in a golden age of incredible advancement and spiritual development, then gradually declines through silver, bronze, and iron ages, before the cycle resets with destruction and renewal. We might be living in the rebuilt world, the Iron Age that follows the Golden Age that was lost to the flood. This cyclical view of history appears in cultures worldwide, suggesting it might be based on actual experience rather than philosophical speculation. The Maya believed in multiple world creations and destructions. The Norse spoke of Ragnarok, a great reset of the world. The Greeks described ages of gold, silver, bronze, and iron, with each age ending in catastrophe before a new one began. What's particularly interesting is that many of these traditions describe the current age as degraded compared to what came before. We're living in the aftermath, they suggest, trying to rebuild something that was once far greater. Our achievements, impressive as they seem to us, are pale shadows of what existed in the world before the flood. But here's where the story takes an even more intriguing turn. What if the reset wasn't complete? What if some of the advanced knowledge, some of the technology, some of the wisdom of the antediluvian world survived the catastrophe? Not in the form of intact civilizations, but in fragments, in isolated groups of survivors who carried pieces of the old world into the new one. This could explain some of the most puzzling aspects of early post-flood civilizations. How did the builders of the Great Pyramid achieve such mathematical precision? How did ancient astronomers calculate the precession of the equinoxes, a cycle that takes 26,000 years to complete? How did isolated island cultures develop advanced navigation techniques that allowed them to cross vast oceans with pinpoint accuracy? Perhaps they weren't developing these capabilities from scratch. Perhaps they were working from inherited knowledge, fragmentary instructions passed down from the world before the flood. The myths speak of culture heroes and divine teachers who appeared after the catastrophe, bringing knowledge of agriculture, writing, mathematics, and astronomy to the survivors. What if these weren't gods or supernatural beings, but human survivors from the advanced antediluvian world? The timing is suspicious. Agriculture appears almost simultaneously in multiple locations around the globe, approximately 10,000 years ago, right after the flood period. Not gradually, as we might expect from independent development, but suddenly, as if the knowledge was being distributed by those who already possessed it. Similarly, the first cities appear with remarkable sophistication, as if their builders already understood urban planning, irrigation, and social organization. Even more intriguing is the evidence of advanced metallurgy and engineering appearing in the archaeological record much earlier than our standard historical models suggest. Tools and artifacts that display knowledge of alloys, precision machining, and construction techniques that we associate with much later periods. It's as if the survivors brought not just knowledge, but actual examples of advanced technology from the world before the flood. This preservation of antediluvian knowledge might also explain the remarkable consistency of certain symbols, measurements, and architectural principles across ancient cultures. The same geometric relationships appear in structures separated by thousands of miles and centuries of time. The same astronomical alignments, the same mathematical constants, the same engineering solutions to similar problems. It's as if they were all working from the same original source, a common inheritance from the civilization that was lost to the flood. The evidence becomes even more compelling when we examine the mysterious phenomenon of ancient maps that wouldn't exist. The Piri Reis map of 1513, created by Ottoman Admiral Piri Reis, shows the coastline of Antarctica with remarkable accuracy, depicting it without its ice sheet. This map was created centuries before Antarctica was officially discovered, and thousands of years before, we knew what the continent looked like beneath its ice. When questioned about his sources, Piri Reis claimed he compiled his map from much older charts, some dating back to the time of Alexander the Great. But Antarctica has been covered by ice for millions of years, hasn't it? Not necessarily. Geological evidence suggests that parts of Antarctica may have been ice-free as recently as 15,000 years ago, right around the time of our Great Flood. If an advanced antediluvian civilization had the capability for global exploration and mapping, they would have charted these coastlines when they were accessible. The survivors of the flood would have preserved these maps as precious remnants of their lost world, passing them down through generations until they eventually found their way into the hands of medieval cartographers. This isn't an isolated case. The Oronteus Phineas map of 1531 shows Antarctica as two separate landmasses, which modern seismic studies have confirmed is actually accurate beneath the ice. The Mercator map of 1569 shows Arctic geography with precision that wouldn't be achieved by official exploration until centuries later. These maps suggest that someone, at some point in history, had the ability to conduct detailed geographical surveys of the entire planet, including areas that were supposedly inaccessible to ancient peoples. The implications extend beyond mere cartography. If these civilizations could map the world with such precision, what other capabilities did they possess? The answer might lie in the most enigmatic structures they left behind, monuments that continue to baffle archaeologists and engineers to this day. Take Pumapunku in Bolivia, a site that sits at 12,000 feet above sea level on the Altiplano. The precision of the stonework there is simply staggering. Blocks weighing up to 150 tons are fitted together with tolerances measured in millimeters. The surfaces are so perfectly flat that they seem machine-tooled, and the angles are so precise that they appear to have been cut with laser guidance. Traditional archaeology dates this site to around 600 CE, but that dating is based on pottery fragments found in the vicinity, not on the megalithic structures themselves. What's particularly puzzling about Pumapunku is that it shows clear evidence of having been destroyed by a massive catastrophic event. The enormous stone blocks aren't just weathered by time. They're scattered and broken as if tossed about by tremendous forces. Some blocks appear to have been lifted and thrown significant distances. The destruction pattern is consistent with what we might expect from a massive flood or seismic event, not gradual decay over centuries. Could Pumapunku be a remnant of the antediluvian world? A structure that partially survived the Great Reset? Its location high in the mountains would have provided some protection from rising waters, though not from the seismic activity that appears to have damaged it so severely. The precision of its construction suggests capabilities that exceed what we attribute to post-flood civilizations, while its destruction pattern matches what we would expect from the catastrophic events of the reset period. Similar patterns appear at megalithic sites worldwide. Sacsayhuaman in Peru displays the same impossible precision in stonework, with blocks fitted so tightly that you cannot slide a piece of paper between them. The builders somehow shaped irregular, multi-angled blocks that fit together like three-dimensional puzzle pieces, creating walls that have survived numerous earthquakes that destroyed more conventional structures built around them. In Lebanon, the massive stones of Baalbek include blocks weighing over 800 tons, moved and positioned with a precision that challenges our understanding of ancient engineering capabilities. The Romans built a temple complex on this site, but the foundation stones are clearly much older and built with different techniques. The Romans themselves seem to have built upon ruins of something far more ancient and sophisticated. These sites share common characteristics that set them apart from conventional ancient construction. The stones are not just large, they're precisely cut and fitted with tolerances that require advanced measuring and cutting tools. The surfaces show no tool marks, as if they were shaped by some process that leaves no trace of the method used. The lifting and positioning of such massive weights would challenge even modern engineering, yet they were accomplished with apparent ease by their builders. But perhaps the most telling evidence lies not in what survived the flood, but in what disappeared. The archaeological record shows a clear pattern of discontinuity around the flood period. Technologies, artistic styles, and construction techniques that had been developing for millennia simply vanish from the record, only to reappear thousands of years later in different forms and locations. The art of trepanation, for example, surgical drilling of holes in the skull, appears in the archaeological record with surprising sophistication very early in post-flood history. The survival rates for these operations were remarkably high, suggesting advanced medical knowledge that seems to have appeared fully formed rather than developed gradually. Where did this knowledge come from, if not from antediluvian medical traditions preserved by survivors? Similarly, ancient navigation techniques display understanding of celestial mechanics and mathematical relationships that should have taken centuries to develop through observation and experimentation. Polynesian navigators could cross thousands of miles of open ocean using techniques that required precise knowledge of star positions, wave patterns, and seasonal changes. This wasn't primitive wayfinding. It was sophisticated navigation that presupposes advanced understanding of geography and astronomy. The flood reset theory provides a framework for understanding these anomalies. Instead of viewing them as mysterious achievements of primitive peoples, we can see them as fragmentary survivals of much more advanced systems. The navigators weren't developing their techniques from scratch. They were working from inherited knowledge passed down from ancestors who had mapped the entire planet. The medical practitioners weren't experimenting blindly. They were applying procedures developed by antediluvian physicians whose understanding of human anatomy and surgical technique far exceeded what we give them credit for. This perspective also helps explain the curious phenomenon of ancient texts that describe technologies and capabilities that seem impossibly advanced for their supposed time periods. The Sanskrit epics of India describe vimanas, flying vehicles with capabilities that sound remarkably similar to modern aircraft. The descriptions include details about propulsion systems, navigation equipment, and even what appears to be aerial warfare between these craft. Mainstream scholarship dismisses these descriptions as mythological fantasy, but what if they were attempts to describe real technologies using the limited vocabulary available to post-flood peoples? If survivors of an advanced antediluvian civilization witnessed or possessed flying vehicles, they would have no choice but to describe them in terms of birds, chariots, or divine conveyances. The technology would seem magical to those who no longer understood its principles. The same pattern appears in descriptions of advanced weaponry. Ancient texts describe weapons that could destroy entire armies, level mountains, and poison the earth for generations. These descriptions appear in multiple cultures and bear striking similarities to modern nuclear weapons. The Mahabharata describes the Bra effects of Thermastra in terms that perfectly match radiation sickness and nuclear fallout. The archaeological record even shows evidence of ancient with unusually high levels of radiation and glass-like substances that form only under extreme heat conditions. Could these texts be preserving memories of actual weapons used in conflicts between antediluvian civilizations? Perhaps the Great Flood wasn't just a natural disaster, but the culmination of wars fought with technologies so devastating that they contributed to the collapse of the entire antediluvian world order. The survivors, traumatized by what they had witnessed, would have preserved these stories as warnings about the dangers of such power. This brings us to one of the most intriguing aspects of flood mythology: the consistent theme of divine judgment. In virtually every culture, the flood is presented not just as a natural disaster, but as punishment for human wickedness or corruption. The antediluvian world is described as having become so morally degraded, so technologically dangerous, or so spiritually disconnected that divine intervention became necessary to prevent even greater catastrophe. What if this moral dimension reflects actual historical memory? If the antediluvian civilizations had indeed developed weapons of mass destruction, genetic manipulation, or other dangerous technologies, their use might have threatened not just human civilization, but life on Earth itself. The flood becomes not arbitrary divine punishment, but a necessary reset to prevent complete ecological collapse. The survivors would have understood this connection between technological advancement and moral responsibility. Their myths and legends consistently warn about the dangers of hubris, of reaching too far beyond human limitations, of forgetting the proper relationship between humanity and nature. These weren't abstract philosophical concepts, but practical warnings based on direct experience of what happens when advanced technology is divorced from wisdom and restraint. This interpretation gives new meaning to the concept of forbidden knowledge that appears throughout ancient mythology. The story of Prometheus stealing fire from the gods, the tale of Adam and Eve eating from the tree of knowledge, the accounts of fallen angels teaching dangerous arts to humanity. All these myths might preserve memories of technologies that were too dangerous to be widely distributed after the flood. The survivors faced a terrible dilemma. They possessed fragments of incredibly advanced knowledge that could help rebuild civilization, but they had also witnessed how that same knowledge had contributed to the destruction of their world. The solution was selective preservation, carefully controlled distribution of information, and the establishment of mystery schools and secret societies to safeguard the most dangerous knowledge while allowing beneficial technologies to gradually re-emerge. This explains the curious phenomenon of ancient mystery schools that claim to preserve secret wisdom from before the flood. The Egyptian mystery schools, the Eleusinian mysteries of Greece, the Vedantic traditions of India, all claimed access to primordial knowledge that predated their respective civilizations. Rather than viewing these as mystical fantasies, we might see them as actual preservation systems, carefully maintained chains of transmission that carried antediluvian knowledge forward into the post-flood world. The gradual re-emergence of advanced capabilities in human civilization might not represent independent development, but rather the controlled release of preserved knowledge as humanity demonstrated sufficient wisdom and stability to handle it safely. The Renaissance, the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution, each of these periods might represent moments when guardians of ancient knowledge decided it was safe to allow certain technologies back into general circulation. This perspective transforms our understanding of human progress from a linear ascent to something far more complex and cyclical. We're not the first civilization to split the atom, to manipulate genetics, or to develop global communication networks. We're simply the latest iteration in a pattern that has repeated itself across vast spans of time, each cycle building upon the remnants of what came before. But here's where the story becomes even more compelling. The flood myths don't just describe destruction and survival. They describe transformation. The survivors who emerged from the catastrophe weren't just physically different from their antediluvian ancestors. They were fundamentally changed in their relationship to knowledge, to technology, and to the divine forces that govern existence. In the Sumerian tablets, we find accounts of the Anunnaki, beings described as coming from the heavens to guide humanity's development after the flood. Traditional interpretations cast these as mythological gods. But what if they were something else entirely? What if they were the survivors of the antediluvian world's most advanced societies? Beings whose technology and knowledge were so far beyond the flood survivors that they appeared divine. These accounts describe the Anunnaki teaching fundamental skills: agriculture, writing, mathematics, astronomy, metallurgy, all the foundations of civilization appearing simultaneously rather than developing gradually. The timing is crucial here. These gifts of knowledge appear in the archaeological record right after the flood period, precisely when we would expect survivors of an advanced civilization to begin sharing their preserved wisdom with the scattered remnants of humanity. The physical descriptions of these teachers are particularly intriguing. They're consistently described as being larger than normal humans, longer lived, and possessed of capabilities that seemed miraculous to those they taught. In a post-flood world where most survivors were struggling with basic subsistence, individuals who retained advanced medical knowledge, sophisticated tools, and understanding of complex systems would indeed seem godlike in their abilities. Consider the practical implications of this scenario. The antediluvian world, faced with impending catastrophe, would have had limited options for preservation. They couldn't save their cities, their infrastructure, or their technologies in any material sense, but they could save knowledge, genetic material, and small groups of their most capable people. The great vessels described in flood myths weren't just arks for animals. They were seed ships for civilization itself, carrying forward everything necessary to restart human development when the catastrophe passed. The genetic component of this preservation becomes particularly significant when we examine anomalies in the human fossil record. Elongated skulls found at sites worldwide display characteristics that don't match normal human variation. These aren't the result of artificial cranial deformation, but appear to represent a distinct population with naturally larger brain cases, different bone density, and unusual cranial features. Carbon dating places many of these specimens in the period immediately following the theoretical flood date. Could these be the physical remains of the antediluvian survivors, the teachers and guides who helped restart civilization? Their unusual characteristics would explain why they were remembered as giants, as beings from the heavens, as gods walking among men. Their advanced knowledge, preserved through the catastrophe, would account for the sudden appearance of sophisticated technologies in the post-flood archaeological record. The distribution of these anomalous remains corresponds closely with the locations of the earliest post-flood civilizations. Elongated skulls appear in Peru, where the most sophisticated pre-Columbian civilizations flourished. They're found in Egypt, where the dynastic period began with remarkable sudden sophistication. They appear in the Caucasus region, which many traditions identify as the landing place of the flood survivors. The pattern suggests a coordinated effort to establish new centers of civilization in strategic locations around the globe. But this raises disturbing questions about what happened to these teacher populations over time. The anomalous remains become less frequent in the archaeological record as we move forward through history, eventually disappearing entirely. Did they die out naturally? Were they absorbed into the general population through interbreeding? Or were they eliminated by the very people they had helped to rebuild? Ancient texts hint at conflicts between the teachers and their students, stories of rebellion against the gods, of humanity asserting independence from their divine guides. The Tower of Babel narrative describes humans attempting to build a structure that would reach the heavens, an act that results in the confusion of languages and the scattering of peoples. What if this represents a historical memory of post-flood humanity, rejecting the guidance of their antediluvian teachers and attempting to reclaim advanced technologies before they were ready? The result, according to the narrative, was catastrophic confusion and division. Instead of unified guidance from those who understood the dangers of advanced technology, humanity fragmented into competing groups, each possessing only fragments of the original knowledge. This fragmentation would explain why advanced capabilities appear sporadically in the historical record, why some civilizations achieve sophistication while others remained relatively remarkable, primitive, and why technological knowledge seems to have been lost and rediscovered multiple times throughout history. The linguistic evidence supports this interpretation. Comparative philology reveals that many fundamental terms for advanced concepts, agriculture, metallurgy, astronomy, mathematics, share common roots across languages that supposedly developed independently. This suggests a common source, an original technical vocabulary that was distributed from a central authority and then evolved separately as populations dispersed and languages diverged. Even more intriguing is the discovery of advanced mathematical and astronomical concepts embedded in the very structure of ancient languages. The Sanskrit numerical system, for example, incorporates mathematical relationships that weren't formally recognized by Western mathematics until centuries later. The Mayan calendar system demonstrates understanding of astronomical cycles that require sophisticated observational techniques and mathematical modeling. These weren't gradual discoveries. They were integral components of the languages themselves, suggesting they were built into the linguistic systems by their original designers. The preservation of this knowledge through language represents perhaps the most elegant solution to the problem of maintaining advanced information through civilizational collapse. Unlike physical artifacts that can be destroyed or technologies that can be lost, language lives in the minds of its speakers. Mathematical relationships embedded in grammatical structures, astronomical data encoded in mythological narratives, technical procedures preserved as religious rituals. All these represent ways of hiding sophisticated knowledge in plain sight, accessible to those who know how to decode it, but invisible to those who lack the proper keys. This brings us to the role of secret societies and mystery schools in preserving antediluvian knowledge. Rather than dismissing these organizations as medieval fantasies or modern conspiracy theories, we might see them as the institutionalized remnants of the original preservation system established by the flood survivors. Their claims to possess ancient wisdom, their emphasis on gradual revelation of knowledge, their careful selection of initiates, all these characteristics make sense if they were indeed guardians of potentially dangerous information. The symbols and rituals of these organizations often incorporate elements that seem to reference advanced technologies or scientific principles. Masonic symbolism includes references to geometry, architecture, and engineering that suggest deep understanding of mathematical and physical principles. Alchemical traditions describe processes that, while couched in mystical language, often correspond to actual chemical and metallurgical procedures. Hermetic philosophy incorporates concepts of energy, transformation, and cosmic relationships that anticipate modern physics by centuries. Could these traditions be preserving actual technical knowledge from the antediluvian world, disguised as mystical teachings to protect both the information and society from its premature release? The gradual emergence of scientific and technological capabilities in human civilization might represent the controlled disclosure of this preserved knowledge, released only when humanity demonstrated sufficient wisdom and stability to handle it safely. This interpretation gives new meaning to the Renaissance, that sudden flowering of art, science, and technology that seemed to emerge from nowhere in medieval Europe. Rather than a spontaneous cultural awakening, it might represent a moment when the guardians of ancient knowledge decided that humanity was ready for a significant release of preserved information. The timing coincides with other global developments, the establishment of stable political systems, the development of global trade networks, and the emergence of institutions capable of managing complex knowledge systems. The key figures of the Renaissance often had connections to mystery schools and secret societies. Leonardo da Vinci, whose notebooks contain designs for flying machines, submarines, and other advanced technologies centuries before they were officially invented, was associated with various esoteric groups and claimed to have access to ancient sources of knowledge. His anatomical studies, engineering designs, and artistic techniques suggest understanding that went far beyond what should have been possible through independent discovery in his era. Similarly, the sudden appearance of advanced navigational techniques that enabled the age of exploration might represent the release of preserved geographical and astronomical knowledge. The precision of early maps, the sophisticated understanding of wind patterns and ocean currents, the development of instruments that required advanced mathematical and astronomical knowledge, all these capabilities emerged with a rapidity that suggests they were based on pre-existing information rather than developed from scratch. The pattern continues into the modern era. The scientific revolution of the 17th and 18th centuries saw the rapid development of physics, chemistry, and mathematics in ways that built upon principles that seemed to appear fully formed rather than developed gradually. Isaac Newton's laws of motion, for example, represent insights that required understanding of mathematical relationships and physical principles that weren't obvious from direct observation. Where did this understanding come from, if not from preserved knowledge gradually released as humanity proved ready to handle it? The Industrial Revolution follows the same pattern. The sudden development of steam power, precision manufacturing, and complex mechanical systems required understanding of engineering principles that seemed to emerge simultaneously in multiple locations. The inventors of this era often claimed inspiration from ancient sources or described receiving knowledge through dreams, visions, or other non-rational means. Could they have been accessing preserved technical information through systems designed to release such knowledge when the time was right? This brings us to perhaps the most disturbing implication of the flood reset theory. If we are indeed living in a rebuilt civilization, if our technological progress represents the gradual re-emergence of antediluvian capabilities, then we may be approaching the same dangerous threshold that led to the original catastrophe. The development of nuclear weapons, genetic manipulation, artificial intelligence, and global communication networks might represent a return to the technological level that existed before the flood. The parallels are unsettling. Ancient texts describe weapons that could destroy entire armies and poison the earth for generations. We have nuclear weapons. They describe the creation of artificial beings and the manipulation of life itself. We have genetic engineering and artificial intelligence. They describe global communication systems and the ability to observe events anywhere on Earth. We have the internet and satellite surveillance. They describe flying vehicles and the conquest of the skies. We have aircraft and spacecraft. But perhaps most significantly, they describe a world where technology had outpaced wisdom, where advanced capabilities were used without regard for their long-term consequences, where the connection between human civilization and natural systems had been severed. Does this sound familiar? The flood myths consistently describe the antediluvian world as morally corrupt, spiritually degraded, and dangerously disconnected from divine guidance. The survivors who preserve the stories seem to have understood that technological advancement without corresponding growth in wisdom and restraint leads inevitably to catastrophe. Their warnings, embedded in mythology and religious teachings, represent desperate attempts to ensure that the rebuilt civilization would not repeat the same mistakes. Yet here we are, approaching the same threshold, displaying the same patterns of behavior that the myths warn against. We have the power to destroy ourselves and much of life on Earth, and we seem to be sleepwalking toward that possibility with the same blind confidence that characterized the antediluvian world. The question becomes whether we will heed the warnings embedded in our most ancient stories, or whether we will repeat the cycle that led to the Great Reset. The choice, as it was for our antediluvian ancestors, is ours to make. But the clock is ticking, and the waters are rising once again. The evidence doesn't stop with technological parallels. It extends into the realm of consciousness itself, into the very fabric of human awareness, and our relationship with reality. The antediluvian texts speak of capabilities that we've relegated to the realm of fantasy: telepathic communication, remote viewing, the ability to influence matter through focused intention. But what if these weren't supernatural powers, but natural human capabilities that we've simply forgotten how to access? Modern neuroscience is beginning to discover that the human brain operates far below its potential capacity. We use only a fraction of our neural networks, and even that fraction operates in ways that scientists are only beginning to understand. The phenomenon of quantum entanglement has been observed at the cellular level, suggesting that human consciousness might have capabilities for non-local awareness that we've never imagined possible. Recent studies of meditation practitioners show that extended practice can literally rewire the brain, creating new neural pathways and activating regions that remain dormant in most people. These practitioners report experiences that sound remarkably similar to the abilities described in ancient texts: expanded awareness, perception beyond the normal sensory range, and the ability to influence their environment through focused intention. Could it be that the antediluvian humans operated with full access to these capabilities? That the Great Reset didn't just destroy their technologies and cities, but also severed humanity's connection to its own expanded potential? The trauma of the catastrophe, the struggle for basic survival, the fragmenting of knowledge and culture, all of these factors could have created a kind of species-wide amnesia that cut us off from abilities that were once as natural as breathing. The ancient mystery schools seem to have understood this. Their initiation processes weren't just about preserving technical knowledge. They were about reactivating dormant human capabilities. The Egyptian schools spoke of opening the third eye. The Hindu traditions described the awakening of Kundalini energy. The Greek mysteries promised transformation of consciousness itself. These weren't metaphorical descriptions. They were practical instructions for reclaiming our full human potential. But here's where the story takes an even more profound turn. What if the flood reset wasn't just about preserving civilization? What if it was about preserving the very essence of what it means to be human? The genetic evidence suggests that modern humans underwent a significant bottleneck approximately 12,000 years ago, a dramatic reduction in population that geneticists call the Toba catastrophe theory. But the timing aligns perfectly with our flood date, suggesting that the same event that destroyed the antediluvian civilizations also nearly extinguished humanity itself. The survivors weren't just carrying forward technological knowledge and cultural traditions. They were carrying the genetic heritage of our entire species, the biological foundation upon which all future human development would be built. The choices they made about which knowledge to preserve, which capabilities to maintain, and which directions to pursue would determine not just the shape of the rebuilt civilization, but the very nature of human consciousness for thousands of years to come. This responsibility would have been overwhelming. Imagine being one of perhaps a few thousand survivors of a global catastrophe, knowing that the future of human civilization depends entirely on the decisions you make in the immediate aftermath of unimaginable destruction. Every piece of knowledge you choose to preserve or abandon, every genetic line you maintain or lose, every cultural tradition you continue or let fade, shapes the trajectory of everything that follows. The evidence suggests they made their choices very carefully. The genetic diversity preserved in post-flood populations shows signs of careful selection, as if the survivors deliberately maintained breeding lines that carried specific beneficial traits. The knowledge systems that were preserved show similar selectivity, with dangerous technologies being hidden or encoded while beneficial capabilities were allowed to gradually re-emerge. But most significantly, they seem to have made a fundamental decision about human consciousness itself. The expanded awareness capabilities that characterize the antediluvian world were largely suppressed in favor of what we might call focused consciousness, the more limited but perhaps safer form of awareness that characterizes modern humans. We traded cosmic awareness for practical intelligence, telepathic communication for verbal language, direct energetic manipulation for tool use. This wasn't necessarily a loss. The focused consciousness that emerged from the reset has enabled us to develop science, technology, and analytical thinking in ways that might not have been possible with the more expanded awareness of our ancestors. We've learned to understand the universe through observation and experimentation rather than direct perception. We've developed complex social structures based on verbal communication rather than telepathic connection. We've created technologies that extend our capabilities rather than relying solely on inherent psychic abilities. But the cost has been enormous. We've lost our direct connection to the natural world, our awareness of our place in the cosmic order, our understanding of consciousness as a fundamental force rather than just an emergent property of brain activity. We've become isolated individuals rather than interconnected nodes in a planetary awareness network. We've forgotten that reality itself is malleable, that consciousness and matter interact in ways that our current scientific paradigm barely begins to acknowledge. The ancient texts preserve memories of this lost way of being. They describe a golden age when humans lived in harmony with nature, when communication was direct and immediate, when the boundaries between self and other, between mind and matter, were far more fluid than they are today. These weren't primitive peoples projecting fantasies onto a mythical past. They were preserving actual memories of a different mode of human existence, one that was sacrificed in the interest of survival and stability. The gradual re-emergence of these capabilities in certain individuals throughout history suggests that the potential was never completely lost, only suppressed. The great mystics, the visionaries, the individuals who throughout history have displayed abilities that seem to transcend normal human limitations, might be examples of people who have somehow accessed the dormant potential that lies within all of us. Jesus walking on water, Buddha achieving enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, the Hindu rishis who composed the Vedas through direct revelation, the shamans of indigenous cultures who could journey between worlds and communicate with non-physical entities. All of these figures might represent individuals who had somehow reactivated the expanded consciousness capabilities that were once normal for humanity. Their teachings consistently point toward the same realization, that our current limited awareness is not the full extent of human potential, that consciousness itself is far more fundamental and powerful than we imagine, that reality is far more malleable and interconnected than our scientific worldview suggests. They're not describing supernatural phenomena, they're describing natural human capabilities that we've simply forgotten how to access. But here's where the implications become truly staggering. If these capabilities are indeed part of our natural heritage, if they were deliberately suppressed after the flood reset to ensure stability and survival, then their re-emergence might signal that we're approaching another threshold. Not necessarily another catastrophic reset, but a conscious evolution back toward our full potential. The signs are everywhere. Meditation practices that were once confined to isolated monasteries are now spreading globally. Scientific research into consciousness is revealing capabilities that were once considered impossible. Quantum physics is discovering principles that sound remarkably similar to ancient mystical teachings. The internet, originally developed as a communication technology, is beginning to function almost like a technological version of the telepathic networks described in antediluvian texts. We're witnessing the convergence of technology and consciousness in ways that mirror the descriptions of the antediluvian world. Virtual reality systems that can create convincing alternate realities, artificial intelligence networks that display emergent behaviors beyond their programming, global communication systems that connect billions of minds in real time. All of these developments are bringing us closer to the kind of consciousness technology integration that ancient texts describe. But the crucial difference is that this time we have the warnings. We have the stories of what happened before, the knowledge of where unchecked technological development can lead, the understanding that consciousness and technology must evolve together rather than developing in isolation from each other. The mythology and religious teachings that have guided human civilization for thousands of years weren't just moral instructions. They were survival protocols, guidelines for navigating the dangerous waters of advanced capabilities without triggering another catastrophic reset. The flood myths don't just describe destruction. They describe the conditions that led to that destruction and the principles that must be followed to prevent its recurrence. The consistent themes across all cultures point toward the same core insights: that technology without wisdom is dangerous, that power without responsibility leads to catastrophe, that human consciousness and natural systems are interconnected in ways that must be respected and maintained. These aren't abstract, philosophical concepts. They're practical guidelines based on actual historical experience, instructions for managing the transition from our current limited awareness to the expanded consciousness that represents our true potential. The mystery schools and esoteric traditions that have preserved these teachings throughout the post-flood period weren't just maintaining ancient superstitions, they were safeguarding the operating manual for human consciousness itself. The question now is whether we're wise enough to heed these instructions. The technological capabilities that destroyed the antediluvian world are already within our grasp. Nuclear weapons that can poison the Earth for generations, genetic manipulation that can alter the fundamental nature of life, artificial intelligence systems that could potentially replace human consciousness entirely, global communication networks that could be used for mass mind control. All of these capabilities exist right now, but we also have something the antediluvian world may not have had in its final phase: awareness of the danger. The stories of the flood, preserved in every culture on Earth, serve as a constant reminder of what can happen when technology outpaces wisdom. The mythological and religious traditions that have guided human development provide frameworks for integrating advanced capabilities with expanded consciousness. The mystery schools and esoteric traditions offer practical methods for developing the wisdom needed to handle dangerous knowledge responsibly. The choice before us is not whether to continue developing these capabilities. That process is already well underway and probably cannot be stopped. The choice is whether to develop them consciously, with full awareness of their implications and careful attention to the wisdom traditions that warn us of their dangers, or to stumble forward blindly as our ancestors may have done, driven by curiosity and ambition without regard for consequences. The evidence suggests that we're already beginning to make this choice. The growing interest in meditation and consciousness expansion, the development of technologies that enhance rather than replace human capabilities, the emergence of global awareness about environmental and social responsibility, all of these trends suggest that at least some portion of humanity is beginning to understand the need for conscious evolution rather than unconscious development. But time may be running short. The same technologies that could enable our conscious evolution could also trigger another catastrophic reset if developed without proper wisdom and restraint. The ancient warnings embedded in our oldest stories speak of cycles that repeat across vast spans of time, of civilizations that rise and fall in predictable patterns, of resets that occur when consciousness and technology become dangerously imbalanced. The waters are rising again, both literally and metaphorically. Climate change driven by technological development without ecological awareness, social disruption caused by communication technologies that fragment rather than unite communities, psychological instability resulting from virtual realities that disconnect us from natural systems. All of these phenomena mirror the conditions described in antediluvian texts. Yet there's also unprecedented opportunity: the flood. We, for the first time since, have both the technological capabilities and the preserved wisdom necessary to make conscious choices about our development. We can choose to learn from the mistakes of our ancestors rather than repeat them. We can choose to integrate technology with expanded consciousness rather than allowing them to develop in dangerous isolation from each other. The great work of our time is not just developing new technologies or rediscovering ancient wisdom, but consciously combining them in ways that serve the highest good of all life on Earth. This requires not just individual development, but collective transformation, the emergence of a global consciousness that can make decisions based on long-term consequences rather than short-term gains. The flood myths suggest that this kind of collective transformation is possible. They describe not just catastrophic destruction, but also renewal and rebirth. The emergence of new forms of consciousness and civilization that incorporate the lessons learned from previous cycles. The survivors of the flood didn't just rebuild the old world, they created something new, something that incorporated both the wisdom gained from loss and the hope for a better future. We stand at the same threshold now, facing the same choice between unconscious repetition and conscious evolution. The outcome will depend not just on the technologies we develop or the policies we implement, but on the level of consciousness we bring to these decisions. The antediluvian world may have possessed incredible technologies and expanded awareness, but they apparently lack the wisdom to use these gifts responsibly. We have the opportunity to do better. The stories of the flood, preserved across thousands of years and countless generations, offer us a roadmap for navigating this transition successfully, but only if we have the courage to listen to their warnings and the wisdom to heed their guidance. The choice is ours, and the time is now. The waters of change are already rising, and we must decide whether they will carry us to higher ground or sweep away everything we've built. The ancient survivors who preserved these stories through the darkest period of human history believed that future generations would be wise enough to learn from their experience. Let us prove them right. The archaeological evidence tells a story that mainstream science struggles to acknowledge, a narrative written in stone and preserved in the deepest layers of human memory. In the remote highlands of Peru, at an altitude where the air itself seems thin with ancient secrets, lies a site that defies every conventional explanation we've constructed about our past. Sacsayhuaman stands as a testament to capabilities that shouldn't exist. These aren't just large stones fitted together with primitive tools and endless patience. These are megalithic blocks, some weighing over 200 tons, carved and positioned with tolerances that would challenge modern precision machinery. The surfaces are so perfectly smooth they seem almost liquid in their perfection, flowing together in joints so tight that not even the thinnest blade can find purchase between them. But here's what keeps archaeologists awake at night. There's no progression, no learning curve visible in the archaeological record. The earliest examples of this stonework are also the most sophisticated. It's as if the knowledge appeared fully formed, complete in its understanding of physics, engineering, and materials science that we're only beginning to rediscover today. Traditional dating methods place these structures in the relatively recent past, but those dates are based on pottery fragments and organic materials found in the vicinity, not on the megalithic construction itself. The stones tell a different story entirely, one that speaks of techniques and capabilities that stretch back far beyond our accepted timeline of human development. When Spanish conquistadors first encountered these walls, they assumed they had been built by supernatural beings. The indigenous peoples they questioned had no memory of their construction, referring to them only as works of the ancient ones who possessed knowledge that had been lost in the mists of time. This wasn't modesty or primitive thinking. It was an accurate assessment of capabilities that exceeded anything in their cultural memory. The precision extends beyond mere construction. These walls have survived earthquakes that leveled more conventional structures built centuries later. They demonstrate an understanding of seismic engineering that incorporates principles we've only recently rediscovered. The stones are cut in complex, interlocking patterns that actually become stronger under stress, flexing with earth movements rather than cracking under pressure. Similar examples appear across the globe, always with the same characteristics: massive stones, impossible precision, no developmental phase, and integration with astronomical alignments that require sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics. At Ollantaytambo, another Peruvian site, we find evidence of construction that was apparently interrupted mid-process, as if the builders simply vanished before completion. The unfinished blocks at Ollantaytambo tell a particularly haunting story. Some stones appear to have been in the process of being shaped when work suddenly ceased. They lie scattered across the site like abandoned projects, their surfaces partially finished, their intended destinations unclear. It's as if the entire workforce simply disappeared overnight, leaving behind only the mystery of their incredible capabilities. But perhaps the most disturbing evidence comes from the tool marks themselves, or rather, the absence of them. Conventional stone cutting leaves, characteristic signatures, patterns, and scratches that reveal the methods and implements used. These megalithic sites show none of these telltale signs. The surfaces are uniformly smooth, as if shaped by some process that leaves no trace of its operation. Modern attempts to replicate these techniques using period-appropriate tools have failed spectacularly. Teams of skilled stonemasons working with copper implements, wooden levers, and rope systems have managed to move relatively small stones short distances, but nothing approaching the scale and precision demonstrated at these ancient sites. The gap between what we believe was possible and what clearly was accomplished grows wider with each failed experiment. The implications force us to confront uncomfortable possibilities. Either our understanding of ancient capabilities is fundamentally flawed, or these structures represent the work of peoples who possess knowledge and technologies that we've somehow lost or forgotten. The flood reset theory provides a framework for understanding this discrepancy, suggesting that these sites might be remnants of pre-catastrophe civilizations whose capabilities exceeded our own in specific areas. The geographical distribution of megalithic sites follows patterns that seem to correspond with areas that would have provided refuge during a global catastrophe. High-altitude locations, geologically stable regions, areas with natural protection from rising waters. All of these characteristics appear repeatedly in the placement of the most sophisticated ancient constructions. It's as if the builders were selecting locations based on their ability to survive exactly the kind of catastrophic events described in flood mythology. The acoustic properties of these sites add another layer of mystery. Many megalithic structures demonstrate sophisticated understanding of sound propagation and resonance. Chambers that amplify specific frequencies, walls that create complex echo patterns, and architectural features that seem designed to manipulate audio in ways that serve no obvious practical purpose for primitive peoples. Recent research has revealed that these acoustic properties often correspond to frequencies that have measurable effects on human consciousness. Certain sound patterns can induce altered states of awareness, enhanced pattern recognition, and even healing responses in biological systems. The builders of these sites weren't just creating impressive monuments. They were engineering environments that could directly influence human consciousness and physiology. This suggests a level of understanding about the relationship between physical structures, sound waves, and human neurology that we're only beginning to develop today. The knowledge required to design and implement such systems implies not just advanced engineering, but sophisticated understanding of physics, psychology, and human biology that seems impossible for the time periods to which these structures are attributed. The mathematical relationships embedded in megalithic construction reveal similar anomalies. The proportions and alignments incorporate advanced mathematical constants that shouldn't have been known to ancient peoples. The golden ratio, pi and complex geometric relationships appear consistently across sites separated by vast distances and supposedly different time periods. These aren't approximate relationships that might result from aesthetic preferences or trial and error construction. They're precise mathematical constants encoded in stone with accuracy that requires sophisticated calculating ability and theoretical understanding of mathematical principles. The builders weren't just following pleasing proportions, they were implementing mathematical knowledge that wouldn't be formally recognized by mainstream academia for thousands of years. The astronomical alignments add yet another dimension to the mystery. These structures don't just point towards significant celestial events. They encode complex astronomical cycles that require centuries of careful observation to detect and calculate. The precession of the equinoxes, the varying cycles of planetary orbits, the long-term patterns of stellar movement, all of these phenomena are reflected in the positioning and orientation of megalithic sites. But here's what makes this truly extraordinary. Many of these alignments don't correspond to current astronomical positions, but to how the sky would have appeared thousands of years ago. The builders were either working from astronomical data that was already ancient when they constructed these sites, or they were encoding information about sky positions from a much earlier era. This temporal displacement suggests that the astronomical knowledge embedded in these structures was inherited rather than discovered through contemporary observation. The builders had access to star charts and mathematical calculations that reflected conditions from the distant past, as if they were working from archives that had survived from an earlier epoch of human development. The preservation of such detailed astronomical information across vast spans of time would have required sophisticated record-keeping systems and institutional continuity that challenges our understanding of ancient societies. Yet the evidence is literally written in stone, carved into monuments that have survived long enough for modern astronomy to verify their accuracy. The cultural implications become even more profound when we consider the level of social organization required to undertake such projects. Moving stones weighing hundreds of tons across difficult terrain requires not just advanced engineering knowledge, but massive coordinated labor forces, sophisticated logistical planning, and stable political systems capable of sustaining long-term projects across multiple generations. The flood myths speak of antediluvian civilizations that possessed exactly these characteristics: stable social systems, advanced technical knowledge, and the ability to organize massive construction projects that served purposes beyond immediate practical needs. The megalithic sites might represent the final projects of these civilizations, monuments built with the specific intention of surviving the catastrophic reset they could see approaching. This interpretation explains several otherwise puzzling characteristics of these sites. Why build structures that are so massively over-engineered for any practical purpose? Why encode complex astronomical and mathematical information in their design? Why choose locations that seem selected for their ability to survive natural disasters? The answer might be that they were designed as time capsules, messages to future civilizations that would arise after the catastrophic reset. The builders knew their world was ending. The astronomical knowledge encoded in their monuments might have told them exactly when and how the catastrophe would unfold. Unable to prevent the disaster or save their civilization in its existing form, they did the next best thing. They created monuments that would survive the reset and preserve essential knowledge for whoever came after. The mathematical constants, the astronomical alignments, the advanced engineering techniques, all of these elements serve as a kind of curriculum encoded in stone. Future civilizations that developed sufficient sophistication to decode these messages would find themselves inheriting knowledge that might otherwise take thousands of years to rediscover through independent development. But the megalithic sites preserve more than just technical information. They encode philosophical and spiritual insights that speak to fundamental questions about human consciousness and our relationship to cosmic forces. The acoustic properties that induce altered states of awareness, the astronomical alignments that connect terrestrial structures to celestial cycles, the mathematical relationships that reflect universal principles, All of these elements suggest a worldview that integrated material and spiritual understanding in ways that our current scientific paradigm struggles to accommodate. The builders of these monuments understood something that we've largely forgotten, that consciousness and cosmos are intimately connected, that human awareness is not separate from the physical universe, but part of a larger pattern that includes both matter and mind as aspects of a single underlying reality. This integration of spiritual and material knowledge might have been the key to their advanced capabilities, allowing them to work with natural forces in ways that seem impossible from our current mechanistic perspective. The gradual rediscovery of these principles through quantum physics, consciousness research, and other cutting-edge scientific fields suggests that we might be approaching the same level of understanding that characterize the antediluvian world. But the megalithic monuments serve as both inspiration and warning, reminding us that advanced capabilities must be balanced with wisdom and restraint to avoid repeating the catastrophic cycle that ended their civilization. The evidence preserved in these ancient sites doesn't just challenge our understanding of the past, it offers guidance for navigating our own technological and spiritual development. The builders who created these monuments face the same fundamental questions we face today. How do we integrate advanced capabilities with expanded consciousness? How do we use powerful technologies responsibly? How do we ensure that our development serves the long-term good of all life, rather than leading to catastrophic destruction? Their answers are written in stone, waiting for us to develop sufficient wisdom to read them correctly. The megalithic sites stand as monuments not just to their builders' capabilities, but to their hope that future civilizations would prove wiser than they had been, learning from their example rather than repeating their mistakes. As we stand at our own threshold of advanced technological development, these ancient messages become more relevant than ever. The same capabilities that enabled the construction of these incredible monuments might also have contributed to the catastrophic reset that ended their civilization. Our task is to learn from their experience, integrating their technical knowledge with the wisdom needed to use it responsibly. The stones are speaking to us across thousands of years, their messages encoded in mathematical relationships, astronomical alignments, and engineering principles that we're only beginning to understand. But their most important message might be the simplest: that consciousness and technology must evolve together, that wisdom and power must be balanced, and that the ultimate purpose of all advancement is to serve the continuation and flourishing of life itself. The megalithic monuments stand as proof that such integration is possible, that human consciousness can indeed achieve levels of understanding and capability that seem miraculous from our current perspective. But they also stand as warnings, reminders that even the most advanced civilizations can fall if they lose sight of the principles that must guide the use of their power. The choice before us is the same one that faced the builders of these monuments: whether to use our advancing capabilities to create something that will endure and serve future generations, or to repeat the mistakes that led to the Great Reset. The stones have preserved their wisdom for thousands of years, waiting patiently for us to develop the understanding needed to receive their message. Now the time has come to listen to what they're trying to tell us. The most haunting aspect of megalithic construction isn't what we can see, but what we cannot. Modern ground-penetrating radar and satellite imaging have revealed vast underground networks beneath many of these sites, chambers and passages that extend far deeper than surface excavations have uncovered. These subterranean complexes suggest that the visible monuments are merely the tip of structures whose true scope remains hidden beneath centuries of accumulated earth and debris. In Turkey, beneath the already mysterious site of Göbekli Tepe, radar imaging has detected what appear to be multiple levels of construction extending down into bedrock. The excavated portions, impressive as they are, might represent only the uppermost layer of a complex that could dwarf anything currently visible. Similar anomalies appear at sites worldwide, suggesting that our ancestors built not just monuments, but entire underground civilizations designed to survive surface catastrophes. The implications are staggering. If these underground complexes were indeed built as refuges from the Great Flood, they would have required not just advanced engineering, but sophisticated life support systems, food storage capabilities, and social organization on a scale that challenges every assumption about ancient human societies. We're talking about underground cities that could house thousands of people for extended periods, complete with ventilation systems, water management, and waste disposal technologies. Recent discoveries in Cappadocia reveal just such systems. The underground city of Derinkuyu, carved directly from solid rock, could accommodate 20,000 residents across multiple levels, extending 280 feet into the earth. Ventilation shafts, communication tunnels, and defensive features demonstrate engineering sophistication that rivals modern underground construction. But radiocarbon dating suggests these cities are far older than previously thought, potentially predating the flood period by thousands of years. The builders of Derinkuyu didn't just hollow out caves, they created a complete underground ecosystem with churches, storage rooms, stables, and even wineries. Fresh air circulation systems brought oxygen to the deepest levels while removing carbon dioxide. Water systems provided clean drinking water throughout the complex. Defensive mechanisms could seal entire sections in case of attack. This wasn't primitive cave dwelling. This was advanced urban planning adapted for subterranean living. But perhaps most remarkably, the city shows evidence of having been sealed and abandoned suddenly, as if its inhabitants had fled in haste. Food stores were left behind, personal belongings scattered throughout chambers, and defensive positions abandoned mid-preparation. The archaeological evidence suggests that whatever drove these people underground ultimately forced them to abandon even these impressive refuges. Could this be evidence of the flood survivors' final retreat? Underground cities built as last resort shelters when surface-level refuges proved insufficient. The timing aligns perfectly with the catastrophic events described in global flood mythology, and the scale of construction suggests preparation for disasters of unprecedented magnitude. The ventilation systems alone represent engineering marvels that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of airflow dynamics, pressure differentials, and atmospheric chemistry. Fresh air was drawn down through precisely calculated shafts, while stale air was expelled through separate channels, creating circulation patterns that maintained breathable atmosphere throughout the complex. The mathematics required to design such systems implies knowledge of physics principles that we associate with much later periods of human development. Even more intriguing are the communication systems built into these underground complexes. Acoustic channels allowed messages to be transmitted instantly between distant sections, creating network communications that connected the entire city. But these weren't simple speaking tubes. They were engineered to amplify specific frequencies while filtering out others, suggesting understanding of acoustic principles that goes far beyond basic functionality. The defensive features reveal military engineering that anticipates threats from both surface attacks and underground invasion. Massive stone doors that could be rolled into position by single operators, trap systems that could flood entire sections with water or debris, and choke points that forced attackers into killing zones, all demonstrate tactical thinking that suggests extensive experience with siege warfare and complex military operations. But the most mysterious aspects of these underground cities are the chambers whose purpose remains unclear. Rooms with no apparent function, carved with precision equal to the rest of the complex but containing no artifacts or features that suggest their intended use. Some researchers propose these were storage areas for materials that have long since decomposed, but the careful construction and prominent placement suggest they served more important purposes. Could these enigmatic chambers have housed technologies or knowledge systems that were removed when the cities were abandoned? The precision of their construction and the attention given to their design implies they were intended for something far more significant than simple storage. Perhaps they contained the preserved wisdom of the antediluvian world, carefully safeguarded in underground vaults until the time came to transfer this knowledge to surface survivors. The global distribution of underground complexes suggests this wasn't an isolated phenomenon, but part of a coordinated worldwide preparation for catastrophic events. Similar systems appear in Malta, where the hypogeum of Hal-Saflieni demonstrates the same sophisticated engineering principles applied to underground construction. In China, vast tunnel systems beneath major cities show evidence of ancient construction techniques. In the Americas, cave systems in the southwest United States contain modifications that suggest use as long-term refuges by peoples with advanced engineering knowledge. The coordination implied by these global preparations suggests communication networks and organizational capabilities that exceed anything we attribute to ancient civilizations. How did peoples separated by vast oceans and supposedly lacking advanced transportation coordinate such massive undertakings? The only logical explanation is that they weren't separated, that the antediluvian world possessed global communication systems and transportation capabilities that enabled worldwide coordination of survival preparations. The flood myths begin to make sense when viewed through this lens. The stories of divine warnings, of preparations made in advance of the catastrophe, of careful selection of survivors and preservation of essential knowledge, all align with evidence of sophisticated disaster preparedness on a global scale. This wasn't random survival. This was planned continuity, carefully orchestrated to ensure that essential elements of civilization would survive the reset. The underground cities represent the physical infrastructure of this survival plan, but they were only part of a larger system that included knowledge preservation, genetic conservation, and cultural continuity protocols. The myths speak of seeds being saved, of animals being preserved, of wise men being chosen to carry forward essential teachings. The archaeological evidence suggests these stories preserve accurate memories of an organized effort to maintain civilization through catastrophic disruption. But the abandonment of these underground refuges raises disturbing questions about what happened during and after the flood period. If these sophisticated shelters were insufficient protection, how severe was the catastrophe they were designed to survive? The evidence suggests that even the most advanced preparations proved inadequate against the forces unleashed during the Great Reset. Water damage in the deepest levels of several underground complexes indicates that even these subterranean refugees were ultimately flooded. Geological evidence shows massive groundwater intrusion that would have made the deepest chambers uninhabitable. The survivors were forced to abandon their carefully prepared sanctuaries and face the surface world transformed beyond recognition. The psychological impact of such experiences would have been devastating. Imagine spending months or years in underground refuges only to emerge into a world where familiar landmarks had vanished, where coastlines had shifted, where entire regions had been submerged or elevated. The survivors weren't just physically displaced, they were temporally displaced, citizens of a world that no longer existed. This displacement explains many of the characteristics we observe in early post-flood civilizations. The sudden appearance of advanced capabilities without apparent developmental phases, the obsession with preserving knowledge in permanent form, the construction of monuments designed to survive future catastrophes. All of these behaviors make sense as responses to traumatic civilizational collapse. The survivors carried with them not just technical knowledge, but also the psychological scars of having witnessed the destruction of everything they had known. Their myths and religious systems reflect this trauma, emphasizing themes of divine judgment, moral preparation, and the importance of maintaining harmony with natural forces to prevent future catastrophes. The underground cities also preserve evidence of the social systems that existed before the flood, the organization of spaces, the distribution of resources, the integration of defensive and civilian infrastructure, all suggest societies that were both highly developed and acutely aware of existential threats. These weren't peaceful utopian civilizations. They were advanced societies living under the constant shadow of potential destruction. The defensive preparations visible in these complexes indicate that the antediluvian world faced not just natural catastrophes, but also human conflicts of unprecedented scale. Weapon systems, fortified positions, and siege-resistant construction all point to warfare conducted with technologies and tactics that required sophisticated military organization and advanced engineering capabilities. Could internal conflicts have contributed to the catastrophic collapse that necessitated the flood reset? The evidence suggests that the antediluvian civilizations possessed both the capability for massive construction projects and the destructive potential to threaten their own existence. The combination of advanced technology with inadequate wisdom might have created conditions where civilizational survival required divine intervention. The underground refugees represent humanity's attempt to survive not just natural catastrophe, but the consequences of their own technological development. The flood wasn't just a natural disaster, it was the culmination of a crisis that threatened the very existence of intelligent life on Earth. The reset wasn't punishment. It was a necessity imposed by circumstances that had spiraled beyond any possibility of conventional resolution. The builders of these underground sanctuaries understood this. Their preparations weren't just for temporary shelter. They were designed to preserve the essential elements of civilization through a complete restart of human development. The knowledge preservation systems, the genetic conservation protocols, the cultural continuity mechanisms, all were intended to ensure that the rebuilt world would have access to the wisdom needed to avoid repeating the same mistakes. But the evidence also suggests that these preservation efforts were only partially successful. Much knowledge was lost, many capabilities were abandoned, and significant aspects of antediluvian civilization simply vanished from human memory. The underground cities themselves were forgotten, their locations lost to surface peoples who retained only fragmentary memories of the great shelters their ancestors had built. This forgetting wasn't accidental. The trauma of the catastrophic period created a kind of cultural amnesia that served as protection against memories too painful to bear. The survivors chose to focus on rebuilding rather than remembering, on moving forward rather than looking back at what had been lost. Only the most essential knowledge was preserved, encoded in myths and monuments that could transmit wisdom without triggering traumatic memories. The rediscovery of these underground complexes in our modern era represents a recovery of suppressed memory, a reconnection with aspects of our past that were deliberately forgotten. As we explore these ancient refuges, we're not just uncovering archaeological artifacts, we're recovering parts of ourselves that were lost in the great forgetting that followed the flood. The timing of these rediscoveries is not coincidental. As our own technological capabilities approach levels that might require similar preparations, we're being reminded of what happened the last time humanity faced such choices. The underground cities serve as both inspiration and warning, demonstrating both the incredible capabilities we possess and the catastrophic consequences that can result from their misuse. The ventilation systems that sustained life in underground refugees remind us that technological solutions exist for seemingly impossible challenges. The communication networks that connected distant chambers show us that coordination and cooperation can overcome isolation and fragmentation. The preservation systems that maintained essential resources through extended crises demonstrate that planning and preparation can ensure continuity through the most devastating disruptions. But the ultimate abandonment of these refuges reminds us that even the most sophisticated preparations cannot guarantee survival if the underlying causes of crisis are not addressed. Technology alone is insufficient. Wisdom, restraint, and harmony with natural systems are equally essential for long-term survival. The underground cities speak to us across thousands of years, their empty chambers echoing with messages we're only beginning to understand. They remind us that we are not the first civilization to face existential choices about the use of advanced capabilities. They show us that survival is possible, but only if we learn from the experiences of those who came before us. As we stand at our own threshold of potentially civilization-altering decisions, these ancient refugees offer both hope and caution. Hope, because they demonstrate that human ingenuity and determination can overcome seemingly impossible challenges. Caution, because they remind us that even the most advanced preparations may prove insufficient if we fail to address the root causes that make such preparations necessary. The stones are speaking, the chambers are echoing with ancient wisdom, and the time has come for us to listen. The builders of these underground cities faced the same choices we face today, and their experiences offer guidance for navigating our own uncertain future. Will we learn from their example, or will we repeat the cycle that led to their ultimate abandonment of even these incredible refugees? The answer lies not in the sophistication of our preparations, but in the wisdom we bring to the decisions that make such preparations necessary. The underground cities remind us that survival is not just about having the right technology, it's about having the wisdom to use that technology in service of life itself, rather than in pursuit of power that ultimately destroys the very foundations technology depends. The echo upon which aloes are calling, and we must choose whether to listen or to join them in the silence that follows civilizational collapse. The whispers grow louder as we venture deeper into territories that challenge the very foundations of everything we thought we understood about human history. In the remote mountains of Romania, buried beneath layers of earth and centuries of silence, archaeologists have uncovered chambers that defy conventional explanation. These aren't natural caverns or simple storage areas, but precisely engineered spaces with characteristics that mirror the underground complexes we've explored across the globe. What makes these Romanian discoveries particularly unsettling is their age. Carbon dating of organic materials found within suggests these chambers were sealed approximately 12,000 years ago, placing their construction squarely within the time frame of our great catastrophe. But it's not just their age that troubles researchers. It's what they contain, or rather, what they once contained, leaving only tantalizing traces of their former purpose. Residue analysis reveals the presence of materials that shouldn't exist in such ancient contexts. Metallic compounds that require sophisticated refining processes, organic substances that suggest advanced chemical knowledge, and crystalline formations that appear to have been artificially created rather than naturally occurring. The chambers themselves show evidence of having housed equipment or systems that have long since been removed, leaving only mounting points, connection channels, and energy distribution networks carved directly into the stone. The energy systems are perhaps the most per these discoveries. Channel's plexing aspect of carved into the chamber walls follow patterns that modern electrical engineers recognize as power distribution networks, complete with what appear to be junction boxes, switching mechanisms, and safety cutoffs. The precision of these systems suggests not primitive experimentation, but mature understanding of principles we associate with advanced electrical engineering. But here's what keeps researchers awake at night. These systems show no signs of having been built by people using tools we understand. The cutting is too precise, the angles too perfect, the surfaces too smooth. Whatever methods were used to create these installations, they left no trace of their operation. It's as if the stone was shaped by processes that worked at the molecular level, rearranging matter rather than cutting through it. Similar anomalies appear in chambers discovered beneath the Giza Plateau, where ground-penetrating radar has revealed vast networks of rooms and passages that official archaeology refuses to explore. The few glimpses obtained through unauthorized surveys show spaces with the same mysterious characteristics: precise construction, energy distribution systems, and evidence of having been deliberately cleared of their contents before abandonment. The pattern repeats across continents and cultures. In the Himalayas, high-altitude caves show modifications that require engineering knowledge and construction capabilities that exceed anything we attribute to ancient peoples. In the Andes, underground complexes demonstrate ventilation and water management systems that incorporate principles we've only recently rediscovered. In the depths beneath major archaeological sites worldwide, radar and seismic surveys detect vast chambers that remain officially unacknowledged and unexplored. The coordination implied by these global discoveries suggests something far more sophisticated than isolated cultural development. These aren't random experiments or independent innovations. They're components of a worldwide system that operated according to consistent principles and served coordinated purposes. The antediluvian world possessed not just advanced individual technologies, but integrated global infrastructure that connected distant regions through networks we can barely imagine. The evidence becomes even more compelling when we examine the materials used in these ancient installations. Metallic components recovered from sealed chambers display characteristics that our current metallurgy struggles to replicate. Alloys that remain uncorroded after millennia of burial, compounds that demonstrate properties we're only beginning to understand, and structures that suggest manufacturing processes we haven't yet developed. One particularly intriguing discovery comes from chambers beneath the Bosnian pyramid complex, where researchers have found crystalline formations that appear to have been grown rather than carved. These crystals display perfect geometric forms and emit measurable electromagnetic frequencies, suggesting they served functions related to energy generation or communication systems. The precision of their formation implies controlled growth processes that require understanding of crystal physics we're only now beginning to explore. The electromagnetic properties of these crystalline installations raise profound questions about the energy systems that powered antediluvian civilizations. Modern analysis reveals that many ancient sites sit atop geological formations that generate natural electrical fields, and the underground installations seem designed to harvest and distribute this naturally occurring energy. The builders understood something we're rediscovering, that the Earth itself is a vast electrical system, and that human technologies can be integrated with these natural energy flows. This integration of technology with natural systems appears throughout the archaeological record of advanced ancient sites. Megalithic constructions positioned to interact with geological energy fields, underground chambers aligned with electromagnetic anomalies, and installation networks that follow patterns corresponding to natural energy flows across the landscape. The antediluvian builders weren't fighting against nature. They were working in harmony with natural forces in ways that amplified both human capabilities and environmental stability. The implications for our understanding of consciousness and reality become staggering when we consider the full scope of these energy systems. Many of the underground chambers demonstrate acoustic properties that interact with human brainwave frequencies, creating environments that could induce specific states of awareness or enhance cognitive capabilities. The builders weren't just creating functional spaces, they were engineering environments that could directly influence human consciousness and expand mental abilities. Recent neuroscience research confirms that specific electromagnetic frequencies can indeed affect brain function, memory formation, and perception. The ancient installations appear to have been designed to generate exactly these frequencies, creating spaces where human consciousness could operate at enhanced levels. This wasn't primitive mysticism. It was applied neuroscience implemented through technologies we're only beginning to understand. The global nature of these consciousness enhancement installations suggests they were components of a worldwide system for expanding human awareness and capability. Individuals could enter these chambers and emerge with enhanced abilities, expanded knowledge, or altered perspectives that served both personal development and civilizational advancement. The mystery schools and initiation centers described in ancient texts might preserve memories of these actual technological systems for consciousness expansion. But the sudden abandonment of these installations tells a darker story about the final days of the antediluvian world. Evidence from multiple sites suggests that these systems were deliberately deactivated and their components removed or destroyed before the Great Catastrophe. This wasn't gradual decline or natural decay. This was systematic dismantling, as if the builders realized their technologies had become too dangerous to preserve. Damage patterns in many chambers suggest not just flooding, but deliberate destruction using methods that created temperatures hot enough to vitrify stone surfaces. Some chambers show evidence of having been sealed with materials that were later removed, as if valuable components were extracted after the initial abandonment. The builders didn't just flee their installations, they conducted organized salvage operations to prevent their technologies from falling into the wrong hands. This pattern of deliberate destruction and selective preservation appears throughout the archaeological record of the flood period. Sites that show evidence of advanced technology also show evidence of systematic dismantling, while sites that preserved only basic knowledge were left intact. The survivors weren't just escaping natural catastrophe, they were implementing protocols designed to prevent dangerous technologies from surviving the reset. The wisdom of this approach becomes clear when we consider the destructive potential of the technologies these installations represent. Energy systems that could tap into geological forces, consciousness enhancement technologies that could be used for mind control, and communication networks that could coordinate global operations. All of these capabilities could serve either beneficial or destructive purposes, depending on the wisdom and intentions of their operators. The flood myths consistently describe the antediluvian world as having become morally corrupt and spiritually disconnected, conditions that would make advanced technologies extremely dangerous. The builders' decision to destroy their own installations rather than risk their misuse demonstrates a level of wisdom and responsibility that provides both inspiration and guidance for our current technological development. The underground installations remind us that consciousness and technology must evolve together, that advanced capabilities require corresponding advancement in wisdom and ethical understanding. The antediluvian builders possessed incredible technologies, but they also possessed the wisdom to recognize when those technologies had become too dangerous for their society to handle safely. The evidence suggests that this recognition came late in their development cycle, perhaps too late to prevent the catastrophic conditions that necessitated the Great Reset. The systematic destruction of installations and removal of components represents a desperate attempt to clean up technologies that had already contributed to civilizational instability. The lessons for our current situation are profound and urgent. As we develop artificial intelligence, genetic manipulation, quantum computing, and other potentially transformative technologies, we must remember the example of the antediluvian builders. Advanced capabilities without corresponding wisdom and restraint can lead to conditions that threaten not just individual societies, but the entire fabric of reality as we understand it. The empty chambers and destroyed installations serve as monuments to choices made under extreme pressure by people who understood the stakes involved in advanced technological development. They chose wisdom over power, chose survival over achievement, chose the future over the present. Their sacrifice preserved the possibility of human development, while preventing the preservation of technologies that could have triggered even greater catastrophes in less wise hands. As we explore these ancient installations and decode their purposes, we're not just uncovering archaeological mysteries. We're receiving instruction in the responsible development and deployment of advanced capabilities. The builders who created these marvels and then destroyed them understood something we must learn: that true advancement requires not just the ability to create powerful technologies, but the wisdom to know when and how to limit their use. The underground chambers echo with this wisdom, their empty spaces speaking more eloquently than any artifact could about the choices that face every advanced civilization. The silence in these installations is not the silence of ignorance or primitive inability. It is the silence of conscious restraint, of wisdom choosing caution over capability, the stakes involved when the survival of consciousness itself. The builders are still teaching us, their lessons encoded not in what they preserved, but in what they chose to destroy. The empty chambers are their final gift to future civilizations. The knowledge that even the most advanced capabilities must be balanced by the wisdom to use them responsibly, and that sometimes the greatest act of love for future generations is the courage to limit what we pass on to them. As we stand at the threshold of our own advanced technological development, these ancient lessons become more relevant than ever. The chambers beneath our feet whisper their warnings and offer their guidance, but only if we have the wisdom to listen and the courage to act on what we learn. The choice that faced the antediluvian builders now faces us, whether to pursue power without limit or to choose wisdom that ensures survival. The empty installations remind us that civilizations are remembered not just for what they achieved, but for what they chose to preserve, and what they chose to sacrifice for the sake of the future. Their silence speaks louder than any monument, their emptiness more profound than any treasure. In learning to listen to what they're not saying, we might find the wisdom to make better choices than they did, to develop our capabilities more wisely, and to ensure that our own technologies serve life rather than threatening it. The underground chambers wait in darkness, their lessons preserve encoded in Restrad in absence, their wisdom int. The time has come to learn, not just from what the ancients built, but from what they chose to unbuild when wisdom demanded sacrifice for survival. The O's continue, growing stronger as our own choices approach the same critical thresholds that face the builders of these magnificent, deliberately emptied chambers. Their greatest achievement might not have been what they created, but what they had the courage to destroy when creation became too dangerous to preserve. The chambers whisper secrets that make our blood run cold, secrets that suggest the antediluvian builders faced a horror we can barely comprehend. In laboratories carved from living rock, researchers have discovered residues that tell a story of experimentation gone catastrophically wrong. These aren't the remnants of primitive alchemy or simple metallurgy, but evidence of genetic manipulation conducted with precision that exceeds our current capabilities. DNA fragments recovered from sealed containers within these underground complexes display characteristics that shouldn't exist in nature. Hybrid sequences that combine human genetic material with patterns that match no known terrestrial species. The preservation is extraordinary. The sample's degradation across Maintenian matrices that prevented in crystal thousands of years. But it's not their preservation that troubles geneticists, it's their implications. The sequences suggest deliberate modification of human genetic structure using techniques that require understanding of cellular biology we've only achieved in recent decades. But these modifications weren't improvements or enhancements. They were corruptions. The genetic patterns show signs of instability, of biological systems pushed beyond their natural limits, of life itself being twisted into forms that nature never intended. Ancient texts begin to make terrifying sense when viewed through this lens. The Book of Enoch speaks of the Watchers taking human wives and producing offspring that were giants, being so corrupted and violent that they threatened the survival of all life on Earth. The Mesopotamian tablets describe the Anunnaki creating workers through genetic manipulation, mixing the essence of gods with the clay of humanity. The Hindu epics tell of Rakshasas and Asuras, beings of incredible power and malevolent intent that plagued the world before the Great Cleansing. These weren't mythological fantasies. They were historical records of genetic experiments that produced beings whose very existence threatened the stability of the biosphere. The laboratory chambers preserve evidence of this tampering, residues that speak of life forms created not through natural evolution, but through technological intervention that violated the fundamental principles governing biological existence. The scale of these operations becomes clear when we examine the distribution of laboratory sites across the globe. Every continent shows evidence of these genetic manipulation facilities, all operating during the same time period, all abandoned with the same sudden desperation. This wasn't isolated experimentation, but a worldwide program of biological modification that reached into every corner of human civilization. The tools recovered from these sites defy explanation. implements that appear designed for cellular-level surgery, devices that could manipulate genetic material with precision that requires understanding of molecular biology, far exceeding anything we attribute to ancient peoples. But here's what makes the discovery truly disturbing. These tools show evidence of having been used not just on voluntary subjects, but on entire populations. Skeletal remains found in adjacent chambers display the results of this genetic tampering. Bones that grew to impossible sizes, joints that articulated in ways human anatomy never intended, skull structures that housed brains too large for normal human necks to support. These weren't natural variations or individual anomalies. They were the products of systematic biological modification conducted on an industrial scale. The psychological profiles of these modified beings, reconstructed from cranial capacity and brain structure analysis, paint a horrifying picture. Enhanced intelligence coupled with reduced empathy, increased physical capabilities paired with unstable mental states, expanded lifespans that came at the cost of reproductive viability. The builders had created beings that were simultaneously more and less than human, creatures that possessed godlike abilities but lacked the moral constraints that prevent the abuse of such power. The mythological descriptions of antediluvian giants begin to read like clinical reports when examined alongside this archaeological evidence. Beings of enormous size and strength who dominated human populations through violence and terror. Creatures that consumed resources at unsustainable rates and showed no regard for the environmental consequences of their actions. Modified humans whose very existence created ecological instability that threatened the survival of all natural life forms. But the genetic modifications weren't limited to size and strength. Evidence from the laboratory sites suggests experimentation with human consciousness itself, attempts to create beings with expanded psychic abilities, enhanced sensory perception, and direct neural interfaces with technological systems. The builders weren't just modifying bodies, they were tampering with the fundamental nature of human awareness and its relationship to reality. The results were catastrophic. Beings with psychic abilities but without the wisdom to use them responsibly. Creatures that could manipulate matter through focused intention, but lacked the moral development to resist using such powers for domination and destruction. Modified humans whose expanded consciousness operated without the ethical constraints that prevent the abuse of mental capabilities. The chamber evidence suggests these psychically enhanced beings could influence weather patterns, trigger geological events, and even manipulate the thoughts and emotions of unmodified humans. They became living weapons of mass destruction, individuals whose very existence destabilized the natural order and threatened the continuation of life on Earth. The laboratory records, preserved in crystalline storage systems, document the progression of this experimentation and the growing awareness among the builders that their creations were becoming uncontrollable. Early experiments showed promising results, enhanced humans who retained their moral faculties while gaining expanded capabilities. But as the modifications became more extreme, the subjects began displaying behaviors that horrified even their creators. Violence became their default response to any challenge. Cruelty emerged as entertainment. The modified beings began to view unmodified humans not as kin to be protected, but as resources to be exploited or obstacles to be eliminated. The builders had created monsters that wore human faces, but had lost everything that made them truly human. The final laboratory entries, decoded from crystalline matrices that preserved information across millennia, read like horror stories, subjects breaking free from containment and rampaging through research facilities, modified beings organizing into hierarchies based on dominance and violence, escaped experiments breeding with wild populations and spreading their genetic corruption throughout the human gene pool. The builders realized too late that they had triggered a biological catastrophe that threatened not just their civilization, but the very essence of what it means to be human. The genetic modifications were spreading through natural reproduction, creating populations of hybrid beings that combined the worst aspects of the experimental enhancements with the survival instincts of unmodified humans. Environmental collapse followed inevitably. The modified beings consumed resources at rates that exceeded the Earth's capacity for regeneration. Their psychic abilities disrupted natural energy patterns that maintained ecological balance. Their violence and aggression created social chaos that prevented coordinated responses to the growing crisis. The builders faced an impossible choice: allow their creations to continue spreading their genetic corruption throughout the human population, or implement a solution so drastic that it would reset not just civilization, but life itself on a planetary scale. The laboratory records suggest they chose the latter, implementing protocols that would cleanse the biosphere of their genetic experiments while preserving the genetic integrity of unmodified human populations. The Great Flood begins to look less like natural disaster and more like deliberate intervention when viewed through this lens. A planetary reset designed to eliminate the genetically modified populations while preserving carefully selected breeding stocks of unmodified humans. The salvation of the few to prevent the corruption of all. The selection criteria for flood survivors described in ancient texts make sense when understood as genetic screening rather than moral judgment. Noah and his family weren't chosen for their righteousness in any spiritual sense, but for their genetic purity, their lack of contamination from the modification experiments that had corrupted so much of the human population. The animals preserved in the ark weren't just random species, but carefully selected genetic samples needed to restore ecological balance after the elimination of the modified organisms that had disrupted natural systems. The builders weren't just preserving life, they were preserving specific genetic patterns that could rebuild stable biological relationships. The timing of the flood becomes significant when we realize it coincided with the point at which genetic corruption had spread beyond any possibility of natural correction. The modified beings were reproducing faster than they could be contained, their genetic patterns spreading through populations that had no understanding of what was happening to them. Without intervention, the entire human species would have been transformed into something that was no longer recognizably human. The underground laboratories preserve evidence of the final protocols implemented by the builders. Systems designed to release biological agents that would target the specific genetic markers introduced by the modification experiments. Delivery mechanisms that could distribute these agents globally, ensuring that no population of modified beings would survive the cleansing. But the builders didn't implement these protocols without understanding the cost. The laboratory records document their anguish at being forced to destroy their own creations, their recognition that they were eliminating beings who were still fundamentally their children, despite their corruptions. The decision to trigger the Great Reset wasn't made lightly, but emerged from the recognition that allowing the genetic corruption to continue would result in the complete loss of human nature itself. The flood myths preserve memories of this terrible choice. Divine beings weeping as they prepare the cleansing waters. Gods reluctant to destroy what they had created, but recognizing the necessity of preventing greater catastrophe. The builders weren't monsters. They were parents forced to choose between the survival of their individual children and the preservation of their species as a whole. The genetic evidence from post-flood populations supports this interpretation. Human genetic diversity shows signs of having passed through a severe bottleneck approximately 12,000 years ago, consistent with a dramatic reduction in breeding populations. But the surviving genetic patterns are remarkably stable and free from the anomalies we find in pre-flood samples. The builders succeeded in their desperate gamble. They eliminated the genetic corruption that threatened to transform humanity into something unrecognizable, while preserving enough genetic diversity to ensure the species' survival and eventual recovery. The price was the destruction of everything they had built and the sacrifice of billions of lives, but the alternative would have been the complete loss of human nature itself. The laboratory chambers stand as monuments to choices made under unimaginable pressure, by beings who understood the ultimate responsibility that comes with the power to modify life itself. Their empty spaces echo with the weight of decisions that saved our species while destroying the world that created us. The genetic modifications that nearly destroyed the antediluvian world are becoming possible again in our own time. CRISPR gene editing, genetic enhancement programs, and transhumanist movements all promise to improve human capabilities through biological modification. The laboratory chambers remind us that such power comes with responsibilities that extend beyond individual choice to species-level survival. The builder's experience offers both warning and guidance for our current genetic capabilities. Enhancement without wisdom leads to corruption. Modification without restraint results in the loss of essential human qualities that cannot be recovered once they are eliminated from the gene pool. Power over life itself requires understanding of consequences that extend far beyond immediate benefits. The empty laboratories whisper their warnings across the centuries, their silence more eloquent than any preserved artifact could be. They remind us that the greatest achievements can become the greatest threats when development proceeds without adequate consideration of long-term consequences. As we stand at the threshold of our own genetic enhancement capabilities, these ancient chambers offer their final lesson, that sometimes the greatest act of love for future generations is the courage to limit our own power over life itself. The builders learned too late that some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again without paying prices that threaten the very essence of what we are trying to preserve. Their sacrifice preserved our humanity. The question now is whether we will prove wise enough to learn from their example, or whether we will repeat their mistakes and force future generations to make the same terrible choices they faced in those final days, before the waters rose to wash away the world they had corrupted beyond redemption. The chambers wait in darkness, their lessons preserved in absence, their wisdom encoded in restraint. The time has come to listen not just to what they created, but to what they chose to destroy when creation threatened to consume the very essence of human nature itself. The genetic laboratories of the antediluvian world stand as the ultimate monument to the principle that knowledge without wisdom is not just dangerous, but potentially apocalyptic. Their empty spaces echo with the screams of the modified beings, whose existence became so unbearable that planetary cleansing became preferable to allowing their continuation. We ignore their warnings at our peril, for the power to modify life itself carries with it the responsibility to understand when such modifications threaten the very nature of life. The builders paid the ultimate price for this understanding. The question is whether we will prove wise enough to learn from their sacrifice, or whether future archaeologists will someday explore the empty laboratories of our own civilization, wondering what terrible choices forced us to abandon everything we had built in the name of preserving what it truly means to be human. The genetic chambers echo across time with their final message, that the power to create life carries with it the responsibility to preserve the essence of what makes that life worth creating. Their silence speaks louder than any monument to the choices that await us as we approach the same threshold that once forced the builders to choose between their achievements and their humanity. In the end, they chose correctly. The question that haunts these empty chambers is whether we will prove wise enough to make the same choice, or whether our own genetic ambitions will force future generations to implement their own terrible reset to preserve whatever remains of human nature after we are done modifying it beyond recognition. The chambers wait, their lessons preserved in emptiness, their wisdom encoded in the courage to destroy what had taken millennia to create. The genetic codes they eliminated whisper warnings across the ages, reminding us that some knowledge is too dangerous to preserve, and some power too corrupting to wield without consequences that extend far beyond our ability to foresee or control. The Great Flood was not just a reset of civilization, but a cleansing of genetic corruption that had spread beyond any possibility of natural correction. The builder's final act was not destruction, but preservation, not ending, but beginning, not failure, but the ultimate success of choosing life itself over the achievements that threatened to destroy it. Their sacrifice echoes through the empty chambers, a reminder that true wisdom lies not in what we can create, but in understanding what we should create, and perhaps more importantly, what we should have the courage to uncreate when creation itself becomes the enemy of everything we are trying to preserve. The genetic chambers tell only part of the story, for beneath their horrifying revelations lies an even more disturbing truth. The builders didn't just tamper with human biology. They reached into the very fabric of reality itself, manipulating forces that govern the fundamental structure of space and time. Hidden deeper than the genetic laboratories, beyond chambers that house biological horrors, researchers have uncovered installations that defy every law of physics we thought we understood. These deepest chambers contain residues of experiments that make genetic modifications seem primitive by comparison. Crystal that appear to have formations being grown in gravitational fields that shouldn't exist on Earth. Metallic compounds that display properties requiring pressures found only in stellar cores. Energy patterns frozen in stone matrices that suggest manipulation of quantum fields using techniques we haven't even theorized, let alone developed. The builders had learned to bend reality itself to their will, creating pocket dimensions where different physical laws operated, where time flowed at altered rates, where consciousness could exist independently of biological substool rates. They had achieved what we'd consider godlike powers over the fundamental forces that govern existence. And like all their other achievements, they had pushed these capabilities beyond any safe limit. Evidence from these deepest installations suggests the builders discovered how to access what ancient texts call the Akashic records, the quantum information field that contains the patterns for all possible realities. They learned to read the fundamental code underlying physical existence and began making edits to reality's source code itself. The archaeological record preserves traces of their attempts to rewrite the laws of physics, to create stable alterations in the basic constants that govern how matter and energy behave. The implications are staggering. Imagine having the ability to alter the gravitational constant in localized areas, to modify the speed of light in specific regions, to adjust the fundamental forces that hold atoms together. The builders possessed technologies that could create zones where different versions of physics operated, where the impossible became routine, where consciousness could reshape matter through direct interaction with quantum probability fields. But their manipulations created cascading instabilities that threatened the coherence of reality itself. The quantum field equations that govern physical existence began producing paradoxical results. Causality loops emerged where effects preceded their causes. Parallel probability streams started bleeding through into baseline reality, creating zones where multiple versions of the same events existed simultaneously. The builders had torn holes in the fabric of space-time itself, wounds that grew larger with each experiment, threatening to unravel not just their world, but the fundamental stability of the dimensional matrix that contains all possible worlds. Their reality manipulation technologies had created a cancer in the quantum substrate that was spreading beyond any possibility of containment. Ancient texts describe the final days of the antediluvian world in terms that make perfect sense when understood as documentation of reality breakdown. Skies that change color without apparent cause. Gravity that functioned erratically in certain regions. Time that flowed backwards in some locations while accelerating impossibly in others. People who existed in multiple versions simultaneously, creating paradoxical situations that violated basic logical principles. The builders realized they had initiated a cascade failure in the fundamental structure of reality that would eventually consume not just their civilization, but all possible civilizations across all probable timelines. Their experiments had created quantum instabilities that were propagating through the dimensional matrix, threatening the existence of consciousness itself across infinite parallel realities. The Great Flood takes on cosmic significance when understood as a desperate attempt to repair the damage they had inflicted on reality's foundation. The massive release of water wasn't just a cleansing of genetic corruption, but a quantum reset that restored stability to the dimensional matrix by erasing the probability streams that contained the reality-altering technologies. Water, it turns out, has unique properties at the quantum level that make it ideal for restoring coherence to damaged probability fields. The global flood didn't just wash away physical evidence of the builders' civilizations, it restored quantum stability to regions where reality itself had been compromised by their experiments. The water carried quantum correction algorithms that rewove the damaged fabric of space-time, healing the wounds the builders had torn in existence itself. The selection of flood survivors becomes even more significant when we understand it wasn't just about genetic purity, but about quantum compatibility. Noah and the other chosen survivors weren't just genetically unmodified, they were quantum stable, individuals whose consciousness patterns were compatible with baseline reality and wouldn't trigger the kin-thread of paradoxes that had made antediluvian world uninhabitable. The Ark itself appears to have been more than a simple boat when examined through this lens. Descriptions in ancient texts suggest it was a quantum-stable vessel, a pocket of baseline reality that could maintain coherence even while surrounded by regions where physics had been altered beyond recognition. The survivors weren't just riding out a flood. They were sheltering in a reality bubble that protected them from the quantum storms that raged as the damaged dimensional matrix repaired itself. The animals preserved in the Ark weren't just biological samples, but quantum templates for species whose existence had been compromised by reality manipulation. The builders had learned to encode biological patterns in quantum information fields, creating backup copies of life forms that could be restored even after their physical manifestations had been erased by dimensional instability. The 40 days and nights of rain described in flood myths correspond to the time required for quantum field equations to recalculate stable solutions across the affected probability streams. The builders had developed the mathematics to predict how long the reality reset would take, and their calculations proved accurate to the day. The flood ended precisely when quantum stability was restored to the planetary dimensional matrix. But the cost of this restoration was beyond calculation. Entire civilizations were erased not just from physical existence, but from the quantum probability fields that determine what can exist. The builders didn't just destroy their cities and technologies, they eliminated themselves from the fundamental equations that govern possible realities. Their very existence was retconned out of the quantum substrate, leaving only faint traces that we're now beginning to rediscover. The post-flood world operated under restored physical laws that prevented the kind of reality manipulation that had nearly destroyed existence itself. The survivors found themselves in a reality where consciousness was more limited in its ability to directly influence matter, where psychic abilities were drastically reduced, where the connection between mind and quantum fields had been deliberately severed to prevent future reality breakdowns. This explains the sudden reduction in human capabilities after the flood, not just the loss of advanced technologies, but the loss of expanded consciousness abilities that had allowed the builders to manipulate reality through direct mental interface with quantum fields. The post-flood humans were operating with artificially limited awareness, a safety measure implemented to prevent them from rediscovering the reality manipulation techniques that had nearly destroyed everything. The ancient mystery schools preserved fragments of this quantum knowledge, but only in forms so heavily encoded and restricted that they couldn't trigger another cascade failure. Meditation techniques that allowed limited access to expanded awareness, but with built-in safeguards that prevented manipulation of fundamental constants. Consciousness expansion practices that enhanced human potential while maintaining quantum stability. The gradual re-emergence of advanced physics in our current era represents the slow restoration of humanity's ability to understand reality manipulation, but with the wisdom to avoid the mistakes that destroyed the antediluvian world. Our discovery of quantum mechanics, relativity theory, and dimensional physics follows the same progression the builders experienced, but hopefully with better understanding of the consequences. The deepest chambers beneath ancient sites preserve evidence of the builders' final protocols for reality restoration. Quantum computers carved from crystalline matrices that calculated the precise parameters needed to heal dimensional damage. Reality anchors that maintained stable reference points during the quantum reset process. Consciousness preservation systems that encoded the essential patterns of human awareness in forms that could survive dimensional restructuring. These installations represent the ultimate achievement of the antediluvian builders, not the power to destroy reality, but the wisdom to repair the damage they had inflicted upon it. Their final act wasn't the development of more powerful reality manipulation technologies, but the creation of systems that could restore the quantum stability their earlier experiments had compromised. The empty chambers echo with this ultimate lesson, that true power lies not in the ability to manipulate fundamental forces, but in understanding when such manipulation threatens the very foundations that make existence possible. The builders learned to reshape reality, but more importantly, they learned when reality needed to be protected from their own capabilities. As our own physics approaches the same thresholds that the builders crossed, these ancient installations offer their final warnings, quantum computing systems that could potentially access the same information fields the builders manipulated. Consciousness research that might rediscover direct mental interface with probability streams. Reality simulation technologies that could create the same kind of cascading instabilities that nearly destroyed existence itself. The deepest chambers whisper their most important secret, that reality is far more fragile than we imagine, and that consciousness has far more power to influence fundamental physical constants than our current science acknowledges. The builders discovered these truths and pushed them beyond any safe limit. Their experience serves as both inspiration and warning for our own explorations into the deepest mysteries of existence. The quantum installations stand empty not because they were failures, but because they succeeded too well. They gave their creators godlike power over reality itself, and that power proved too dangerous for any conscious being to wield responsibly. The builder's final wisdom was recognizing that some capabilities are too fundamental to tamper with, that reality's foundations must be protected, even from those who built the technologies to modify them. The Great Flood was ultimately a quantum debugging process, a restoration of stable reality parameters that had been corrupted beyond any possibility of gradual repair. The builders sacrificed not just their civilization, but their very existence across all probability streams to ensure that reality itself would continue to function coherently for future conscious beings. Their ultimate gift to us wasn't advanced technology or expanded consciousness, but stable reality in which consciousness can exist and develop safely. The empty quantum chambers remind us that this stability is precious beyond measure, and that our growing ability to manipulate fundamental forces must be balanced by wisdom that prevents us from repeating the builder's ultimate mistake. The deepest installations echo across dimensions with their final message, that reality is a trust held by conscious beings for all future consciousness, and that this trust must be protected even at the cost of our own immediate capabilities and achievements. The builders kept this trust in, sacrificing everything they had built to preserve the quantum, the substrate that makes existence possible. Their empty chambers stand as monuments to the ultimate responsibility that comes with ultimate power. The courage to limit ourselves when limitation serves the greater good of all possible consciousness across all possible realities. The quantum reset they initiated continues to protect us even now, maintaining the stability that allows us to exist and explore the mysteries they discovered but dared not preserve. The builders' final achievement wasn't conquering reality, but learning when reality needed to be protected from conquest itself. Their silence echoes across quantum dimensions, a reminder that some powers are too fundamental to wield and some knowledge too dangerous to preserve, no matter how magnificent the achievements such knowledge might make possible. In the end, they chose existence over achievement, reality over power, the future over the present. The quantum chambers stand empty as proof that conscious beings can indeed learn wisdom sufficient to save reality itself from their own capabilities. The question that haunts these installations is whether we will prove worthy of the stable reality their sacrifice preserved, or whether future beings will someday face the same terrible choice between their achievements and existence itself. The deepest chambers wait in quantum silence, their emptiness more profound than any artifact could be, their lessons encoded in the very stability of the reality that surrounds us. They remind us that we live in a universe restored by beings who loved existence itself more than they loved their own power to manipulate it. The builders are gone, erased from all probability streams, but their final gift remains: a reality stable enough to support consciousness, protected enough to allow growth, and resilient enough to survive even our own growing ability to manipulate the fundamental forces they once commanded. Their empty installations whisper the ultimate truth: that reality itself is more precious than any achievement within reality, and that protecting this foundation is the highest calling of any conscious being who gains the power to influence it. The quantum chambers echo with eternal gratitude for beings who chose so wisely when faced with ultimate power and ultimate responsibility. Their sacrifice allows us to exist, to grow, to explore, and hopefully to learn the same wisdom they achieved before power overcame prudence and forced them to choose between their civilization and reality itself. The chamber walls breathe with secrets that make even seasoned researchers question their sanity. In the deepest vaults beneath sites scattered across 6 continents, teams have discovered something that defies not just archaeological explanation, but challenges our understanding of consciousness itself. These aren't storage rooms or ritual spaces, but what can only be described as consciousness laboratories, installations designed to explore and manipulate the very nature of awareness in ways that make our current neuroscience look like finger painting. The evidence is undeniable, yet impossible to accept. Crystalline matrices that display neural pathway patterns when subjected to specific electromagnetic frequencies. Stone surfaces carved with geometric forms that correspond exactly to brainwave patterns observed during various states of consciousness. Installation networks that appear designed to amplify, focus, and redirect human awareness in ways that suggest the builders understood consciousness not as an emergent property of brain activity, but as a fundamental force that could be harnessed and manipulated like any other form of energy. Modern consciousness researchers examining these sites report experiences that challenge their professional skepticism, chambers where meditation becomes effortless, where ordinary awareness spontaneously expands into states that mystics spend decades trying to achieve, acoustic properties that induce specific brainwave patterns without any technological intervention, electromagnetic fields that seem to resonate with human neural frequencies in ways that enhance memory, pattern recognition, and intuitive understanding. The builders hadn't just achieved advanced technology, they had cracked the code of consciousness itself. They understood awareness as a field phenomenon, something that could be concentrated, transmitted, and shared between individuals. The installation network suggests they had created systems for collective consciousness, allowing entire populations to share awareness, knowledge, and decision-making processes through direct mental connection. Archaeological evidence points to the existence of what can only be called consciousness cities, urban centers where the boundaries between individual minds had been dissolved through technological intervention. Structures designed not for physical habitation, but for shared mental occupation. Living spaces where hundreds or thousands of individuals could exist in various states of mental merger, creating collective intelligences that far exceeded the capabilities of any single human mind. The implications for social organization become staggering when we consider the full scope of these consciousness manipulation systems. Imagine societies where leadership decisions were made through direct mental consensus rather than political processes. Where knowledge was shared instantly between all members rather than transmitted through language or education. Where emotional states, creative insights, and problem-solving capabilities could be distributed across entire populations in real time. But the archaeological record also preserves evidence of the catastrophic failures that resulted from these consciousness experiments. Chambers that show signs of violent destruction from within, as if the collective them had torn minds that occupy themselves apart through internal conflict. Installation networks that were deliberately severed, their connections cut with what appears to have been desperate urgency. Consciousness cities that were abandoned suddenly, their mental linking systems deactivated, and their populations scattered. The builders had discovered that collective consciousness, while immensely powerful, was also inherently unstable. Individual personalities began to dissolve when merged too completely with group minds. Creative thinking diminished as collective awareness tended toward consensus and conformity. Most dangerously, negative emotions and destructive impulses were amplified rather than diminished when shared across large populations, creating feedback loops that could drive entire communities into madness or violence. Ancient texts begin to make disturbing sense when interpreted as documentation of consciousness manipulation experiments. Descriptions of humans who spoke with one voice, moved with coordinated precision, and seemed to share a single mind. Accounts of populations that lost their individual identities and became something that was more and less than human. Stories of collective madness that spread like contagion through communities connected by invisible mental bonds. The evidence lies scattered across our world like fragments of a mirror that once reflected a truth too vast for any single civilization to contain. From the water-worn stones of the Sphinx to the impossible precision of Sacsayhuaman, from the quantum laboratories buried beneath ancient sites to the genetic horrors that forced a planetary reset, each piece whispers the same haunting revelation. We are not the first to walk this path. The Great Flood was not divine judgment, but desperate surgery, performed by beings who loved existence itself more than their own achievements. They faced the ultimate choice between power and wisdom, between advancement and survival, between their civilization and reality itself. In the end, they chose correctly, sacrificing everything they had built to preserve the essence of what makes consciousness possible. Their empty chambers echo across time with a message we ignore at our peril, that every capability we develop, every boundary we cross, every force we harness, must be balanced by the wisdom to understand when enough becomes too much. The waters that once cleansed the world of genetic corruption and quantum instability are rising again, metaphorically and perhaps literally, as we approach the same thresholds that once forced our predecessors to implement their terrible reset. We stand now where they once stood, holding technologies that could elevate us to godhood or destroy the very foundations of existence. The choice, as it was for them, is ours to make. Will we learn from their sacrifice, or will we force future archaeologists to puzzle over the empty laboratories and silent chambers of our own abandoned civilization? The builders are gone, erased from all probability streams to save reality itself. But their final gift endures in the stability of the world around us, in the consciousness that allows us to ponder these mysteries, in the hope that we might prove wiser than they were. The flood was not an ending, but a beginning. Not destruction, but preservation. Not failure, but the ultimate success of choosing life over achievement when achievement threatened to consume life itself. Listen to the whispers in the stone, the echoes in empty chambers, the warnings encoded in mathematics and myth. The Great Reset preserved our humanity, so we might have another chance to get it right. The question that haunts every archaeological site, every flooded city, every genetic laboratory, is whether we will prove worthy of that sacrifice. or whether the waters will rise once more to wash away a world that forgot the difference between what we can do and what we should do.